thanks everybody for taking time to join me this morning for my talk on talking to children about illness. As Steve said, I do encourage you to turn your video off and your sound off. There is such a thing apparently called Zoom fatigue, which is impacted on by the ability to see yourself and be conscious of what you look like on screen. So to allow you to focus on the talk, please do feel free to turn your video off. I'm probably going to talk for probably about 15 or so minutes, because we've started a little bit late on talking to children about illness, and then have a few minutes for questions at the end. What I would say is that there's far too much content in this talk to do justice in this amount of time. So I'm happy to do further sort of run-throughs in more detail about some of the different age ranges, if that would be helpful. So do let Steve or myself know. Obviously, with the COVID pandemic right now, talking to children about illness is something that perhaps we're coming across in our personal lives or in our work in hospital, school. But the information in this talk hopefully is generally useful for those of us who might work with children who experience illness themselves or who have illness in their family. So we're going to briefly think about what is the role of education staff in talking to children about illness, and think about some general good principles. And then I'm going to run through in quite a brief way the stages of cognitive development and how that impacts on illness understanding. And we're going to finish up with just a few suggestions on how you can manage what might be quite tricky questions from young people and their families, particularly about the COVID pandemic. So first of all, I'm going to keep this as a talk, so I'm not going to ask you for feedback on this, but something to think about yourselves in your teams that you work in, and for OHS as a whole. What is your role in talking to children about illness? Do you see yourself as having a role in directly explaining about illness, and particularly about coronavirus, to children? Do they ask you questions, and would you answer them? And how do you feel about that? So in my role, quite often, it is an explicit part of my work with some young people to do a piece of work around adjustment to illness, where we might expect this to be quite a big bit of the work, but you might feel differently in your role. In terms of why it's important for us possibly to undertake at least some of this role in our work in education, we can help to contain anxiety about illness. And we know that if young people feel less anxious, they're more likely to focus on other things, such as their schoolwork, for example. And we also know that if young people adjust well to a situation like the pandemic or to any illness information, they're more likely to have better psychological outcomes. And again, that will impact on their ability to achieve their educational potential. So why else is children's knowledge of illness important? First of all, to say that every child and family will be different. So this talk contains some very general information, but it's really important to think with that family about what their understanding is. But we must make sure that this is done well, because it can help to reassure and comfort the child at a time when children and adults are very stressed and worried about the situation. And it offers us an opportunity to identify, explain and correct any misconceptions the child has, which will only serve to promote their adjustment and psychological well-being. We also know that if a child understands the concept of illness appropriately, we're likely to maximize the chance of promoting healthy behavior. So, for example, understanding why we can't go outside and run around and meet our friends is more likely to help us adhere to that, versus not really understanding why that's being asked of us. Obviously, we want to minimize distress and help children manage anxiety. But it's really important for a child's well-being that we do as much as we can in uncertain times to improve their sense of control over a situation, and so that they get a sense of being able to do what they can do and take the decisions that they can make to help them feel contained and safe. So there are multiple things that contribute to a child's understanding of death and illness. Today we're going to focus on that top bubble, which is developmental stage. But we will also need to think about that child in the context of their family. So what are the family and parental views about illness? So some families might have a thought that they don't want their child to know the name of an illness, or they don't want them to hear about people dying. That might impact on the information that they're provided, how much exposure to the news there is. There is also cultural and religious beliefs. So culture might relate to a whole host of factors, such as family culture. Religious beliefs might vary according to, again, what particular religious leaders are talking about. And I think it's been really helpful with Ramadan to have some faith leaders talking about how coronavirus interacts with faith and giving advice to people who follow that particular faith. Past experiences and a child's age are also critical. So if a child had a past experience of negative ill health, then they're much more likely to feel anxious about what's currently happening. And when I say age, obviously, when we think of age, we're really thinking of the developmental stage. So if a child has a learning disability or learning needs or any other factors that might make you think that actually their chronological age doesn't give a true account of their developmental stage, then please do think about the child from the developmental stage presented rather than their chronological age. So as some general points, and I guess the reason I put this slide in here is because I probably am assuming that many of you will be having conversations with parents, and parents might be saying to you, oh, my child is saying this, they're doing this, is this normal? What do you think? I'm worried about this. And so just as a few general points, it's okay that children often believe things that are logically incompatible, or they might come out with things that they've maybe heard adults talking about or heard on the news that isn't quite right or isn't quite true, and that's okay. And we'll come to look at what you can expect from each developmental stage in a minute. But as adults, we are often far more worried and uncomfortable about talking to children about illness and death than children themselves are. So often children will have questions that they want answered, and sometimes they don't always seem to be sensible or logical questions to us as adults, but it does give you an insight into what's going on in their head. If we know what typical responses are in our role when we are talking to parents remotely on the phone or via video link, we can help to normalise and contain their anxiety. And we know that parental anxiety is probably the single biggest predictor of child anxiety. And so if we can help to do that, it'll impact positively on the child. And it might also be helpful to help contain the family in terms of their siblings also. So in terms of the actual developmental stages, I'm going to focus on the key points from each stage. And again, I can put on additional sessions for people working predominantly with the different age groups, if that would be helpful. But in terms of 3 to 7 year olds, this is an age where children are often protected in some ways by illness and death discussion, simply because the level of cognitive development is at a very basic level. So they're primarily influenced by their immediate environment, and they use empirical logic, so what has happened and what is likely to happen, to gauge what the world around them is like and likely to do. So in terms of younger children, they will often be very focused on the impact that illness has had on what they can do, like their play, like their ability to go outside, and much less focused on the wider societal impacts. So death remains an abstract concept at this time for children. And so although they might use the word death, they might see it in cartoons and so on, the concept of permanence will be quite a new one to them. And they are unlikely to have their own concept of that, but primarily be influenced by what the adults around them say. So in terms of what children at this age might do, they might overgeneralize, and they might think that illness is caused by not following certain rules, and it's as simple as that. They'll have very little understanding of the role of internal processes in illness, and they will be influenced by the things like stories and books, magical thinking, and filling in blanks with illogical explanations. In terms of this age group, we know that promoting routine and structure is very important, as with all age groups, but offering opportunities for play so that the child can use stories and drawings to explore how they're feeling, and for adults not to be alarmed. Hearing lots of things about coronavirus tag, for example, and adults should normalise that as a typical way of children at this age expressing themselves. So at this age, we need to keep answers concrete, we need them to be simple, and we need to avoid sort of long inside the body explanations. We need to try and avoid euphemisms, but we need to make sure that any inaccuracies are appropriately corrected. So moving on to slightly older children, still primarily primary school age, we start to understand at this age that there's a difference between the self and the other, and we can see things from multiple perspectives. So we start to understand the impact of these things on other people. So this is helpful in explaining to children at this age that other people too will be going through this, which can be more helpful than at a younger stage where children are primarily influenced by the impact on their own lives. Children start to get a bit more of a sophisticated understanding of illness. So it's a set of symptoms. Some things might help, other things might not help. And no matter what you do, sometimes it won't help at all because of the illness itself. And children at this age have a strong grasp of death being permanent and that can happen to themselves or their loved ones. So because children at this age often have a sense of other people's emotions, they might struggle to voice their concerns as they don't want to upset people. And we might get an increase in somatic symptoms such as headaches and stomach aches and so on. Children can struggle to understand that what's going on inside their body is related to the stress that they're experiencing. So what can we do? So encouraging discussion and facilitating emotional expression. So things like a feelings box where children can put in their worries, their happy moments that an adult can spend time going through with them each week. Making sure that the child doesn't take on adult roles, and thinking about a more sophisticated way of explaining illness to them and linking to some of the health behaviours that we're asking them to do. Moving on to the teenagers, I'm aware I'm going through this really quickly just because of time, but this is the age which often poses more difficulty in that cognitively children are much more sophisticated. They can think hypothetically and in a more abstract way, but this opens up a can of worms in that they can think of possibilities, alternatives, and they can fill in the gaps. So children at this age might think about a worldview of coronavirus, for example. What does this mean? What does this mean for my family? What does this mean in terms of fairness, equality, and bring in social issues into their thinking too. It contradicts, though, with children at this age being primarily still influenced by their peer group. So thinking about what their friends are doing. So if they've got friends that are going out and about and sort of flouting the lockdown rules, this might cause some moral dilemmas for some young people because of the way their brain is able to think about illness and conflicting with the need often to fit in and to do what their friends are doing. So in this age group, we might see young people putting on a brave face and being stoical, but perhaps not wanting to talk about it, not wanting to show that they're worried or to feel different. And at this age, particularly with parents having to juggle the different demands of work, looking after the child, the home, and so on, young people can often feel like they need to take on more adult roles and help out and not want to be perceived as a pest, for example. So we might see less questions of parents. So obviously it's really important that we're encouraging social interaction. So I know some schools, for example, are doing their lessons in a group format where the young people can still see each other throughout the lesson, and feedback I'm getting is that that's really helpful. So as much formal and informal contact that we can provide through remote means will really help this age group. Making sure that parents are giving time to talk to their children about any worries that they have and so on, and not presuming that they're old enough to be able to understand this stuff and to process it, but also respecting their privacy when they want some time alone, because obviously at this age it would be very unusual normally for young people to be spending quite so much time at home with their parents. So that's a really quick whiz through of the developmental stages and what the impact will be on what we see in the young people that we're working with. I want to just briefly bring it back to what is our role and more specifically your role as educators, whether questions will come up in your sessions with children and whether parents will ask you for advice. So I wanted to share some thoughts of ways I've found helpful in my clinical work managing this issue, because obviously thinking back to that first slide, there's a lot of different factors that impact on a child's understanding, and probably one of the least known factors that we will have access to information on is what the parents have told them and what the parents want them to know about it. So a good starting point to sort of sidestep some of these questions and maybe helpfully think about a way forward is to find out what the young person already knows about it. So if you get faced with the question like, well, what is coronavirus? Will I get ill? Will I die? Starting off by gathering some information. So tell me what you already know about it. What makes you ask that? And is that something that you've heard other people talking about? To get a bit of a sense check of what they know and where they've got that information from. And secondly, finding out what the gaps are and who can help. So who do they talk to about these worries? Is that something that's open in their household, or is that something that they've tended to keep quiet about? And I know from working with yourselves and working with lots of young people that it is often the teachers that young people talk to, and you hold a lot of this information and have those relationships. So it's quite possible that you will get asked these questions, and you might already have been asked these questions. And often my role is simply to help the young person make a list of the questions that they have and to think about who can answer them. So it might be that you don't feel comfortable to answer those questions, but you can support the young person to say, okay, let's make a list of these and who's the best person to ask. Well, maybe mum or dad could help with that one. That's well, I could probably answer for you, and so on. And often if they are really tricky questions and you feel in a bit of a pickle about what to do, being explicit with the young person that asking mum and dad to help with this question will be the best way forward, as they'll know you best and the most helpful way of explaining it and taking it back to the young person's family to help with that. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm very aware that it's been very quick. And I hope it's been useful to think about some of these issues. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and take any questions briefly that you might have.